we're just a couple of days now away from the kickoff of the month of June, which is really celebratory, obviously Pride Month for the LGBTQ movement, activists, etc. And yet God, his word doesn't change. He's unchanging, and he still calls us as his sons and daughters to really embrace and live in humility, not to live in pride and the celebration of that which God calls sin.
My father had me outside on this summer day, and without really having any idea what was going to happen, within moments, he had shared with me of his desire to become a woman. By the time I was 13, with developing young, there was a lot of enviness that my father had for me, which was very hard. I felt like I had to stuff down being a girl. I couldn't show my femininity in front of him because that's what he wanted, that it would possibly make his feelings arise. There was so much jealousy for who I was becoming as a young woman that's what grew intense. And then, of course, when he began to wear my clothes.
Where we're at in culture today really lies at the feet of the church. It's not the world's responsibility to be salt and light. It's the church's responsibility to be salt and light. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this time of Love and Truth Network podcast. I am so excited for you to meet a dear friend of mine and a ministry partner. Denise Shick has been doing work in this ministry space for many, many years. And again, she's just been a dear friend to me and to Melissa. And we just have huge respect for her. She's an author, both of books for people who are wrestling and struggling, and some of the topics we'll talk about. And Denise will talk about that, but she's also authored some books for kids in this arena too, and we're so grateful that she's doing that. There needs to be a lot more out there. We need many more resources for kids and youth and teens, as well as adults. And so the more that people can respond to the urging of the Lord to write and really bless who we are as image bearers of God in our maleness and in our femaleness, as we can write about the glory and the beauty of binary gender and doing sex and doing relationships and doing life God's way. That really is the pathway for human thriving. It isn't only about standing on truth. Of course, that's foundational. Truth is foundational. If we lose that, we lose everything else. But this is really about knowing that the way that God, the designer, has made us is what leads to human thriving. So today we're going to be talking with Denise about a topic we're going to be discussing throughout the month of June in our podcast, which is humility and honor. It's a theme. It's an initiative that we came up with as Love and Truth Network staff, and we've just wanted to have not only a response for the month of June, where there's so much confusion, there's so much throwing off of the good image of God and the directions that God leads us into, but where there's just, again, a lot of confusion, but it's not only for the month of June, it progresses kind of throughout the year. So this will be an evergreen theme that we keep going, and we'll be bringing back up again this theme of humility and honor, which God calls us to within the body of Christ. So having said all of that, Denise has been a friend for many years. I was once the Northeast Regional Coordinator for Exodus International, which back in that time was an amazing organization. It had been an amazing organization for 30 years, 35 years, something like that, and really only went downhill in the last year or two of its existence. And but Denise and I had been, and also Melissa, my wife, we'd all been connected really through that the beautiful ministry at one time of Exodus International, and so grateful for what it once was. And we're also grateful for Restored Hope Network that really sprang up from a number of ministries that had to leave Exodus International because it no longer represented an orthodox view of human sexuality sexuality. And so Restored Hope Network, we've been thankful for that. Denise and I served on the board of Restored Hope Network together as well, and that was a joy. So I am, again, very excited for you to meet Denise. Denise, thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's great to connect with you again. I miss all of you.
Yes. Well, it's always a joy whenever we get to bump into each other at a conference or do something like this. So, Denise, I would love if you would be willing to share for 10 minutes or something. If it runs a little bit over than that, that's fine. But just to share your story, and then when you're done with that, I do want to just make sure that we give people an opportunity to know how to connect with you, what some of the books are that you've written and those kinds of things. And then we'll kind of dive into our topic a little bit more. But if you could just share your story a little bit and fill people in a little bit more on who you are and the ministries you lead and all of that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. So my story really began when I was that 9-year-old little girl. My father had me outside on this summer day, and without really having any idea what was going to happen, within moments, he had shared with me of his desire to become a woman. He shared with me how I would know when he was feeling this way, what he would be doing behind the scenes. And I really thought as a child, that's Dad, we're two separate people, this won't impact me. And that's really, Gary, where I think children aren't able to process that part of it. What does this actually mean for me? Because it does. It changes things. And it changed the fact of, well, if Dad's really a woman, then who's going to give me away at my wedding? Who's going to teach me what to look for in a young man to date? And from there, I also began to grieve that loss. So while he's sharing this, these thoughts are going through my mind, but I'm thinking, I don't have a dad anymore. And so grieving that loss silently. And I say silently because I really didn't feel I could go to anybody. I was trying to protect my mother, who was sick often with migraine headaches. And I thought that I would just make her sick if she knew what Dad had shared with me. And I had younger siblings to protect. But by the age of 11, I started to second guess God and wonder if God, maybe he did make a mistake. Maybe Dad should have been a woman. But with that trap that we can fall into, I began to think, well, if God made a mistake with Dad, then how do I know that I'm supposed to be a girl? How do I know that I was not supposed to be a boy? And just kind of fell into that trap for a little bit of time of confusion about who I was and uncertainty that I had in the middle of this chaos. But through that journey, God had really brought me to the point where I was feeling more secure about who I was, which, praise God, that he had done that. By the time I was 13 with developing young, there was a lot of enviness that my father had for me, which was very hard. I felt like I had to stuff down being a girl. I couldn't show my femininity in front of him because that's what he wanted, that it would possibly make his feelings arise. And with that, there was just a constant stuffing down of not feeling free to be a girl.
Yeah.
And so by 14, I started to save my lunch and babysit money to drink. I'm just really looking, as most of us do, something to kind of cope, to hide behind the pain of what we're going through. And at that time, I mean, it didn't matter if it was football games, school, in the middle of school, you'd go off to the girls' restroom and you had friends that always had booze or something, whiskey somewhere with that. And as time progressed, I can remember things by ages because I remember where I was in school,
right.
And at that time as well, I thought about suicide. Things were getting so tense between my father and I. The looks that he would give me that just made me crawl inside. There was so much jealousy for who I was becoming as a young woman, that's what grew intense. And then, of course, when he began to wear my clothes. So as things were tightening up and feeling like it was kind of choking me, God was so good, as he honestly is with all of us, if we just hang in there and hang on to him. Because at this time of my life, he had sent a young man, Mark, that was wanted to get to know me. He had an interest in who I was. And Mark was a Christian. And so the fact that Mark had come into my life and cared about me wasn't like the other typical boys. That drew an interest. It's like, he's different. There's something that's different about him. And through that relationship that helped me to hang on through the many journeys that still came on. I could tell people I came to Christ at 14. Did that make it all go away? No. Right. I even thought that it would. I thought my anger for my dad would go away. I thought the hatred that I had for what he was doing to our family would go away. But it hadn't. And so I continued to stuff things down, not saying anything to anybody. And yet thought maybe Dad was getting help, because his family members were really good about sweeping things under the rug and pretending, living in that denial. But I realized on my wedding day, when I went up to greet my dad, and he looked at me and said, "I wish it were me in that gown," that he had not gotten any help, that we were still in this very ill place, a sick place for both of us, for both of our hearts with that. So it was just a constant journey for me, learning forgiveness that came years later. And looking back now, Gary, I wouldn't give that pain up for anything, because of what God's done with it. Yeah. And I think no matter what we go through in life, that when we offer it to him, when we offer our pain, our journey, and just say, "Lord, whatever you want." For some people, that's just living life in a normal way, but in a healthier way and in a more godly way, because of what we learn from the journeys that we've been on. And I think that was part of mine, Gary. I don't know as if I'd have the heart for individuals that struggle with same-sex attraction or transgender issues without going through this and having a dad that I truly did love. But I also understood that there was much brokenness that occurred with him as a child.
Yes. Well, that's huge, Denise. I mean, there's some things that you shared there that I've known you and I've known your story for a while, but I think anytime we share our story, there's often something that we haven't shared many times, or that we don't know about. The emphasis, and I'm sure you do share this a lot, because it's very important. As many things as I think about with regard to what it would be like to have a mom or a dad dealing with gender dysphoria or transgenderism as a young person, the reality of what you had to carry, the reality of what your dad put on you that you frankly should never even had to have known about or worried about, but what he put on you and the pressure you felt of naturally becoming the person that he wanted to be. That had to have just been so heavy. And the need to the feeling of needing to suppress that in some way. That could not have been something that, obviously it wasn't easy to deal with, but I imagine that would have been one of the more difficult aspects of all that you were dealing with.
Yeah, it really was. And trying to figure out who you are. All kids have a difficulty in that anyways. But when you feel that you have to suppress that femininity or that masculinity because of a parent's struggle, it is a huge weight. Often I've heard so many times through the last 20 years, people say, "I don't know how you did it." Well, I did it because I was able to talk with God throughout it. Now, I didn't become born again until I was 15. I was raised Catholic. And so I did have a very firm foundation that God is real. Yeah. And he was the one friend that I had. There were so many days when I'd look outside at that summer sky or those rainy days and looking up at the clouds like you're looking up at heaven and saying, "Lord, I don't know why this is happening, but I know you're with me." And I think that when we believe that in our heart, we can know it in our mind, but we have to connect it in our heart. That can make such a huge difference that we aren't in this alone.
Yep. Yep. Well, and I think also it's so true. And what I think you shared about not wanting to like go back and take away all the pain or take away the circumstance. I mean, nobody wants to go through that again. Nobody would ask to go through it in the first place. But it reminded me of what I now often say for myself, the very things that, I mean, I was so angry with God. I mean, I really hated God or at least who I perceived God to be, which frankly wasn't even close to who he was. But I was so angry with him and full of hatred, and yet he knew what he was not, and he was allowing this, my sin. He wasn't leading me into sin. He wasn't leading me into temptation. The book of James is very clear about that. But he was poised to take all of this brokenness and it both done to me as well as that which I later wound up engaging in myself. He was preparing me to do exactly what I'm doing today. And I feel like what I get to do in ministry and partnering with people like you is what I was created for. Like it gives me joy. It gives me it's exciting to be involved in the kingdom of God. It's not easy, and certainly the space that we're living in now, there's a lot of encroachment on anti-Christian, anti-godly sexuality. I mean, all of that's true. Cancel culture very much growing rapidly. And there's ways in which that feels heavy. But at the end of the day, the reality that God could take all of that brokenness and turn it around for something good for his kingdom and good for both giving him glory and honor, but also giving other people hope. There's nothing like that. I would not trade it either. So agree with you.
Yeah. For people that can connect with you, with what you had gone through in life, to be there as a representation of God and God's love for them with a safe person, and that's the privilege and the honor that he's given us. And I don't think I definitely never dreamed that God would use what I'd gone through, as I'm sure you had. In fact, I say quite honestly that when the Lord called me into this type of work of ministry, I told him no for 2 years.
Right. No, thank you. Yeah.
With them in a way that was so disrespectful. Mm-hmm. And just, my words to him is, no, I've been there. I've done that. You go find somebody else.
Yes.
But when he did not give up on me, God put such pressure on my heart that it honestly felt like a boulder, was tied around my chest, and that I couldn't get that weight off. And I finally then was left in a place to beg him and say, you either have to take this from me or you have to open the door, because I am a small town girl and I have no idea what to do with this. Yep.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, God is persistent, right? I mean, he does stay with it when he wants us to be, and for our good, wants us to be involved in something. I mean, it is. You mentioned the word privilege and honor. That it is an honor to be called into his kingdom and to come alongside of him where he's working. And I think of that Henry Blackaby theme from Experiencing God, the workbook from years ago about finding where God is working and joining him there. I love that. And you mentioned the word honor, which again comes back to the theme of what we want to chat about a little bit today, which is humility and honor, really in honor of God, in honor of the way that he's designed us as human beings to flourish, and the way he's designed us not only as human beings but as male and female made in his image. I believe that our ministry believes that that God put his image in us of equal value, but of distinction between masculinity and femininity, and that there's something of the feminine that I don't have, and there's something of the masculine that you don't have, but what we have is of equal value, and the idea that we can lean into what that is, how within the church to live as men and women made in the image of God is a glory and an honor that we get to experience. And in our day, it seems to me like what culture is pushing us toward, and kind of molding even the church in many ways, molding us toward is kind of throwing off what it means to be human, made in the image of God, and just kind of embrace more of an animalistic perspective, certainly around sex and certainly around sex and identity. So, in light of that, we're just a couple of days now away from the kickoff of the month of June, which is really celebratory, obviously Pride Month for the LGBTQ movement, activists, et cetera. And yet God, his word doesn't change. He's unchanging, and he still calls us as his sons and daughters to really embrace and live in humility, not to live in pride and the celebrate. It's not just, it is pride, but it's also the celebration of that which God calls sin. And so, what are your thoughts around that topic coming into June?
Yeah, like you had said with Pride, I think about, the Pride parades, right? And being prideful of the sinful actions, of the sinful behaviors that are going forth. Pride, that shouldn't be part of our heart, or our heart's desire to walk out pridefully in our sin. There used to be a time in our world where we were told, or it was a message that sin or doing something wrong, or that something harmful to oneself or to others, there was shame. There was a sense of humility that was more of the message that we needed to hear about.
Right.
And yet it's the opposite. And I think that honestly helps us, Garry, to realize what this is all about. When we look at the war that we're in, which we are, I feel we are, as Christians, as God's people, standing for holy sexuality and gender, the worth of each person that's born, the creativeness that God has in each of us, and to create a message to be prideful and being able to recreate our bodies, to do whatever we wish sexually wise, is a boundaryless world. There's no boundaries in that. And that doesn't only dishonor God, but I wonder sometimes about the tears of God as he looks at those that he loves so desperately, because he sent his only son to die on the cross for them as well. When we look at it spiritually, I really think that it helps us to realize what we're fighting against and to understand what we have to do to fight that battle.
Yeah, and of course, we know from 2 Corinthians, where Paul is writing about the topic that we don't fight against flesh and blood, but we're struggling against principalities and powers, spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places, and that we're actually called as Christians to tear down our own lofty speculation set up against the knowledge of God. And so we all have a role to play in obeying, in honoring God, and in submission. The pathway of life, the pathway of real joy, isn't in reveling in sin, and it's not in embracing pride and kind of putting shame down by detaching our hearts from it, but rather it's through this doorway of humility, and it's through this doorway of surrender to the one who, first of all, created us and designed us and knows us, and what produces the greatest human thriving, but also to the one who gave his own life to rescue us. So, I just think that, these are realities that are so essential. I was also reminded yesterday or the day before, I was thinking about the concept, really what you were just talking about a moment ago, about this idea of recreating our own bodies. And what's interesting about that is that, you would think that when you watch, programming, even so-called news on the topic, it's this idea, you see these magazines that have, men who are pretending to be women or want to be women on the front cover, and it's the glamour shot. They're so-called maybe gorgeous representations of women, or they're a caricature often. And it's interesting that most men, or many men, who are dressing in drag and putting that on, they're dressing in this kind of a horrendous caricature of what a woman is. It's more of like what you would see more in the area of prostitution, or just a really vampy kind of woman. And what's interesting to me is that, of course, God is a creator. God creates. He gives life. He speaks life. He breathes life. He can take what is that is nothing and bring something into substance to it. Whereas the enemy has no capacity to do that. Satan has no creative ability. All he can do is take what God has designed and distort it and twist it. We see that from the fall, with Adam and Eve. We see that throughout the scriptures. We see that throughout history. And what we're seeing now, in my opinion, I believe, is that, even with this idea of transgenderism, I think one of the reasons it's picked up so much steam is the spiritual forces behind it that are taking this idea of creation. And here you have people who are boys and girls who are mutilating, or doctors are mutilating their bodies, removing healthy body parts, installing, if they're doing bottom surgery, putting in just doing great damage to their bodies, castrating boys, etc., removing breasts from girls, and setting them up for lifelong need for medical interventions and for chemical washes that their body was never designed to take at those kind of levels. Girls were not designed to have testosterone pumped through their bodies. Boys were not designed to have estrogen pumped through their bodies, and the impact of that. And so I just look at that and see really our own stubbornness for sure behind it, but also the enemy's hand behind taking God's good created order and really bringing chaos to it that doesn't produce any kind of real thriving.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. When we realize that Satan, he's not very creative himself, so he's going to duplicate. He's going to try to duplicate what God has created and to twist that. Exactly what you said, Gary. I couldn't have said it any better. The fact that people, we look at the magazines or the TV shows or whatever people look at, and they think, oh, they've got such a great life. Oh, they're happy. They're at peace. They say they're at peace. And I think, okay, how can you be at peace when they have to be on the testosterone or the estrogen the rest of their life? When a majority of them are on antidepressants and anxiety medicines the rest of their life. There is no free time away from drugs for them. Mm-hmm. And how many going to counseling, how many individuals that regret this, 8 to 10 years to 12 years later, after they've distorted their bodies, and they try to come at peace between them and God of what they've done because then of the guilt, the shame that they feel by, to the Creator himself. There's so much travesty underneath this deception. But, just the Target stores, right? People are supposed to go in, it's just like buying clothes. It's such a false perception of what the reality really is behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. And, it really saddens me. I've known a number of people who have embraced this journey of let's just back up and talk about the reality that LGBTQ is not the issue that's come on the scene that has really messed up our world or has in some ways caused problems in our churches or whatever. The truth is, I'm a firm believer, and I love the church. I was a pastor, for 12 years in upstate New York, and I'm pastoral staff, and I am a firm believer that where we're at in culture today really lies at the feet of the church. It's not the world's responsibility to be salt and light. It's the church's responsibility to be salt and light. And in our churches, the reality of our compromise within the church, that we have also, the divorce rate in the church is not the same as in the world, but it's still way too high. The idea that I'm going to live for myself, that basically, okay, I have prayed a prayer, and maybe it was genuine in some cases. In my case, it certainly was not. I simply wanted fire insurance. I wasn't surrendering to anyone at the time, until coming to Christ for real in my early 20s after making a wreck of my life. But how do we help, I guess, in this process of being Christians, of being the church? How do we really help people engage in what's going to help them most thrive if we ourselves in the church are living lives that are compromised? We're often saying the right things. There's a lot of teaching and preaching and communication that's true and biblical, and yet so many Christians are living, I think the vast majority, not all sexual, but the vast majority of Christians are living double lives. We're living lives where we vocalize what's true, but then we go back to our refrigerators and our pantries, and we devour food to satisfy whatever is broken within, or we turn on our computers and we engage in pornography and masturbation to somehow, whatever the case is, we are communicating one thing, but then living outside of the power of it. And I think it's a lot of what's opened the floodgates of where the world has become so confused, because we're not offering, as the church, we have not offered a message of genuine hope for this life. Maybe we've talked about the afterlife, and we've talked about not going to hell and going to heaven. But the main reason that Jesus came to die for us was to break the power of sin in our life. That includes eternity, but that includes this life right now. And I think that we've really, as a church, have lived in a lot of compromise that's opened the door for a lot of this confusion. What are your thoughts about that, Denise?
I couldn't say things any better than what you're saying. I think one of the things too, when you said about how you wanted the fire insurance, right? You didn't really lay down your life and submit to anybody. So I think in the church with people, we've become very comfortable in our sin, in the things that we're doing that are not of God's best for us. And in comfortableness, we go to church, we may feel guilty. That's part of the problem, Gary. People aren't fully surrendering to the Lord, whether it's their struggles or their sinful behaviors. It's more of a successful way that makes them feel like they have, but let me go home and get back on the porn, or whatever it is that they're so wanting to do and to look at. Yeah. Well,
and you and I also over the years have both known people who have gone down this path of trying to transition, which of course a man can never become a woman can never become a man, a boy can never become a girl can never become a boy. But we've known people who have gone down that pathway of pursuing that, and even if they can pull off the look, at a chromosomal level, they are still their biological gender, period. Their biological sex, their biological gender. And as we've known people who have pursued that path, trying to find fulfillment, trying to find, and why wouldn't they? I mean, there's so much quote unquote positive messaging around, this is going to be this is going to be what that you're looking for. This is who you are. This is going to solve all life's problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so talk about having these false promises that they're holding out there. I'm an advocate to say conversion therapy is definitely happening, but it's happening in the other direction from what we usually hear. That the only thing that's getting pushed is pro-gay theology and pro-LGBT whatever. But as Christians, even when someone comes to us, like in Canada, for example, somebody comes to a pastor in Canada, comes to a counselor in Canada, it's illegal now for them to even, pray with them in a way that aligns with their right of self-determination, or to give them any counsel that aligns with their right of self-determination. They're supposed to direct them back to someone who's only going to tell them what they don't want, which is you need to just embrace this feeling, embrace these desires, and become part of the LGBT community. Again, to me, that's conversion therapy in the opposite direction. Having said all of that, we know people that have gone down that road to one degree or another, whether it's social transition, whether it's chemical, hormonal transition, or even surgical, even to the point of both top and bottom surgery. And then they came to an awareness that this was never going to satisfy. This was not, and maybe for a period of time it felt like it did, but like you said, it's oftentimes 8, 10, 12 years later when the deepest sense of regret sets in, and there's a sense of doing irreversible damage, using Abigail Schreier's book that she wrote on this topic, especially with girls, using that phrase. But we've known people that have actually surrendered their lives to Jesus and come back to a full agreement with who they are as a biological man or woman made in his image. Even if they've done real damage to their bodies, they can still re-embrace who God created them to be, and most importantly, embrace him as both Savior and Lord. And I want to leave this podcast with some hope that no matter how far you've gone down a path, there's scars, there's things I wish that I'd never done that I had done that still impact me today. The Lord is so gracious, and I have a life that is so full, and I'm so thankful for it. But even when you bear the scars of having done great damage or allowed great damage to be done to your body, the Lord is still calling you to pursue him, to find him, to surrender to him, and give him your life. What are your thoughts around that topic, Denise?
I remember, first of all, with my dad, 13 years later, living as Becky and looking like this elderly woman, his words before he passed away was, these were his own words, this transitioning did not bring me the satisfaction that I thought that it would.
Yes.
And so I'm like, bingo, right there is from somebody that lived this life that nobody would have known as a biological male, thinking the whole time something happened to Dad while he was away. Well, they'll figure out who he is because, DNA testing, the science behind. But to offer the hope, of those that have transitioned, that maybe haven't transitioned, but they're just trying to figure out who they are, to just know of God's goodness. There's a story of Evie that I had the honor to walk with her 3 years as she detransitioned. But this took a team.
Yes.
There was a team that we surrounded around her, and if I had to be out of the country, so I had a team behind her when she was going off the testosterone, so that so that she wouldn't feel to go with her feelings, which would be to take more of the testosterone, to have a team of a church that worked with her, with an elderly couple that went to the courthouse when she went to go get her birth name back, to have another team of gals that helped her in relationship to going into the women's restroom, to be comfortable with that and how they had practiced that out, to another gal that understood that she was not a girly girl, that she would never and was never comfortable in frilly things.
Yes.
But would go into the women's department, to have somebody that understood the anxiety that could create and how to go about it. As people, we can become a teamwork around the individual to help them see that they are loved, that they are not discarded, because we have all made mistakes. And we still make mistakes. There's not one of us that's perfect. The hope of Christ. And if they go to a church where they feel maybe disrespected as a human being, then leave that church. Don't be angry at God, but leave that church and find another one. And understand that it's the people there. It's not God himself. We don't want, my heart would never want anybody to feel that God disregards them as people do because they fail in offering grace and the understanding behind these issues.
So true, so true. It reminds me of the reality that it was finally coming into a men's group at a church, which is the last place on earth I wanted to be, but coming into a men's group, and God used these guys to really tap into, they didn't have a clue of what they were doing, but to really tap into this latent seed of masculinity that my dad had never understood how to activate. But these guys, God just used them as a community of men who just loved me, shared their own struggles and brokenness with me, took me under their wing, didn't treat me like I was some bizarre freak like I'd been treated so many times at other churches in the past. And it was really in that acceptance of me as a person, without accepting sin, without accepting the idea or a broken identity as being a gay man, for example, that really there was God redid and recreated so much in me that I thought had been lost and could never be recovered. So there's so much that the church can do, and you don't have to have degrees in human sexuality. I mean, it's great. We need counselors who are well equipped to work with people, for sure. We need to know when to escalate and make sure that other people are getting involved in something that's over our heads. But the truth is, along with counseling, along with good pastoral care, people just need communities that love them. And of course, the definition of love, we've totally screwed that up. Love is not love. The tagline that runs around 1 Corinthians 13, chapter 6. Of course, we have this whole litany of what love is and what love is not, and we all love that. But then in verse 6, it says, "Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth." The too many Christians are aren't just affirming people for their personhood and the reality that they're image bearers of God, but they're also affirming behavior that is actually not causing thriving for that person, that is actually contrary to God's word, and that biblically is not actually loving. So we want to be a church that is available to really walk with broken, hurting people. That's who Jesus came to rescue, right? He came for the sick. He came for the lost. And he makes that clear over and over and over again. He did not come for the self-righteous or for those who are absolutely headlong determined that no matter how I live my life, no matter what kind of sexual stuff I do, I am just fine. I'm perfect. There's nothing wrong with me whatsoever. That also sets that person outside of the care, at least at that point in their life, of what Jesus can offer to them. And so again, it really is not about pride and arrogance and celebration of sin. The doorway of real healing, the doorway of real freedom comes through humility and honor of God, honor of one another, honor of our own selves made in the image of God. And this is a message that just runs counter to the culture right now. That's for sure. So, Denise, I just am so thankful for you and so thankful for our friendship, and just the work that you're doing and all that you're pouring out. How can tell us for a little bit what you're doing as far as writing and whatever you want us to know about the ministries that you're overseeing and how people can get in touch with you from this podcast.
Yeah, so writing, in the last recent years has been writing children's series that are tackling the lies that they are being fed from the LGBT, that if a boy likes to play piano, then that's too feminine, that's too gayish, or perhaps boys more into fashion, or the girl wants to learn a certain sport in comparison. And so the books are meant to tackle the very lies that they're being fed in society, but to build them up in a biblical way and to leave biblical references for the parents. The most recent book that's been probably the most challenging of the children's books that I just released is titled, "I Want My Sister Back." And so this book is tackling when a older sister wants to transition and has an older brother that's okay with it. So we're getting into the real facts of the situations families are facing today. But what about the little girl? What about, Ava, that's trying to comprehend what's happening? And so the story will, continue on with a couple editions that will follow. But it's a message, the messages that God impresses on my heart to write on. He's been so good to guide the pen and to continue to work in this area as long as he calls me to. So I have two ministries, Help for Families, which focuses on the transgender issue, and then Living Stones Ministries, which is there to support families of those that have loved ones identifying as homosexual. And both of these ministries are meant for family members. They come alongside of different resources, annual conferences, support groups, online groups, studies, just really trying to see what is the need. Do they need pastoral support? Something new that we'll be announcing here is that I finally had gone through and been certified as a life coach in grief. So will be added to help the families in the midst of, or the beginning of their grief, of their situation. We just, I say we because I feel like it takes a team, just like having you, Garry, as a friend and a colleague. We all want God's goodness for the people that contact us. We want them to have God's healing, to know God as you and I know him, as their healer, as their fortress that they can run to. And so we just try to help families however that we can.
That's great. And what's the best way to reach out to you if anyone's interested?
Sure. Really, if they go to www.help4families.org, it'll actually bring up either site. There'll be a landing page. So whichever issue they may be having to struggle with in their family.
Well, hey, I'm sincere in what I was praying about earlier. I'm really praying for and trusting that there's going to be an oasis. Again, even if it's a busy, crazy schedule, but that God's going to grease the skids and is going to move some things forward in a way that you really had the enemy coming against you in some recent days and weeks. So bless you in that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Love and Truth Network podcast. To listen to or watch future episodes, please check us out at loveandtruthnetwork.com/podcast. Also, you can subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future episode.